Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Podcana. I'm joined by Moyen to talk set 4 metagame. Looking forward towards the Lorcana Challenge in Chicago, which is coming up tomorrow. Very exciting. Moyen, what are your thoughts on the set 4 metagame from a high level? Like, where do you see it kind of playing out post set 3? Set 3, we had a very disruptive deck win the Lorcana Challenge in Atlanta in the form of Amethyst Amber. And then, of course, we had Frank Carson win on Amber Steel in Lille. How do you see it sort of changing from a macro level in terms of like the impact of set 4 going into Chicago?
I think in set 3 we had the most diverse meta game and like very well balanced game we've ever had. Now I think there's in set 4 I think we have four big contenders that are fighting for like the top slots. That we'll get to in a bit, and all of those are can do some really unfair things.
Yeah, it does feel like the metagame has gotten a bit narrow. That being said, it is early days. And, even if we looked back towards set 3, I would say set 3, week 1, week 2, the metagame did look a lot more narrow than it did at the end. So that can tend to happen in Lorcana. Nevertheless, I feel like in set 4, we have, like you mentioned, those four pillars of the metagame just doing extremely unfair things. It feels like if you're not in that sort of S tier, A tier range, like you are far behind. Like you are not doing anything close to the power level of some of these top decks. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. And I think this is the best one to start it with, and that's Green Steel. So Green Steel is definitely the talk of the town. If you have any interaction with Lorcana on Twitter, you've seen people talking about Green Steel and talking about Bucky the Squirrel in particular. In my opinion, I think that Green Steel is the deck to beat at Chicago. I'm not sure if it's de facto the best deck in set 4, but in terms of the Chicago metagame, I think that the number one deck that needs to be on your radar is Green Steel. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Green Steel is incredible, and people are only getting better at building the deck as we move along. I think the like more flatbone, heavier approach that like doesn't really focus on the three cost Ursula or Sudden Shiz. I think that deck is like really strong and consistent and powerful. And now if people also start to time their shift Diablos a little bit more efficiently, I think the deck is really a menace.
Yeah, I think this is a clear S tier deck to beat. And probably the most powerful deck in the metagame. You know, that's going to be subjective. People are going to tell you this deck
Mm-hmm.
or that deck is more powerful. But most people, I think, if they had to pick the one deck that represents set 4 right now, they would pick Green Steel. Anyway, let's hop into Amethyst. I always get these mixed up. Amethyst Emerald. Amethyst Emerald is a deck that you brought to Lille actually in set 3, and I remember actually, like, if we talk day 1 metagame of set 4, this was being touted as the best deck of set 4. People were looking at this deck, they saw the additions of Diablo, they saw the additions of the big Ursula, like, okay, this is the best deck of set 4. It has really fallen off in the sort of 1 to 2 weeks since then. Where do you think this deck lands right now?
Um, this is not one of the four pillars we talked about, but I don't think it's that far behind. I played this a lot today, and I actually think it is quite powerful. One way to go about it is basically the reason why this deck still has merit is because it plays Merfolk openness into Ursula stuff and against Ruby Sapphire, and then it has also Gold Reach in the later stages of the game. So it's like I think it's still the best deck against Ruby Sapphire. Um, so that alone has some merit, but even the Emerald Steel matchup isn't that bad because you can play 4 Peter Pan Shadowfinder. Um, and in Ruby Amethyst, some people have been trying out that card to tech out for Diablo, but in this deck it's even better because giving your Diablo rush means you can sometimes exert it if your opponent has something with 1 strength or less. Exert it the turn you play it, so you immediately get the draw. So I've been having a lot of fun with this deck. I think its biggest weakness from the four pillars would be against Sapphire Steel, and I don't think it can do much about that. But I still think it's a pretty good deck.
Yeah, would you be comfortable putting that in A tier, or do you think it's more of a B tier deck?
Um,
I, d-
if
I
we
don't think a
have
lot's
decks
gonna
in A
fall into
tier,
A tier, to be fair, because
yeah.
we talked about the big drop of for power level. Like I don't think we're gonna have a lot of decks fall into A tier.
So basically, if we want to put decks in A tier, I think we should put it there. We could also just have like a gap between S and B tier.
Yeah, I think that there is, there are some B tier decks, but how would you compare this specifically to, another deck that I think is powerful, but not a pillar of the metagame, and is definitely kind of getting hated out right now is Ruby Amber. How do you think this compares in power level to something like Ruby Amber? Do you think that they would both be A tier decks, or is Ruby Amber maybe a B tier deck? Because if I'm trying to think about how do we delineate on these rankings, I would probably
Mhm.
put Ruby Amber as the quintessential B tier deck, and then maybe put this one in a category above it.
Okay, I think that's fair because Ruby Ember in a vacuum it might be more power level, but I think what's holding Ruby Ember back is really that it has a bad matchup into Emerald Steel, and I don't think I don't think you can be an A tier if you have a bad matchup into like the deck we expect to see a lot that's really dominating the meta right now.
Yeah, and I picked out Ruby Amber sort of out of order because I think it was a good way to evaluate the power level of this Amethyst Emerald that we were talking about. That being said, Ruby Amber is one of the decks that probably it feels like it increased the most in terms of power level for set 4. It got so many different tools. It I don't know if you've played against it yet, but it draws so many cards. Like it is such a good mid-range deck. It is just unfortunate that at this moment the top 4 decks in the metagame are doing things that are just broken. Like they are just, I mean, they're just very, 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 very powerful. So when you have this sort of like play efficient threats, draw cards at a slow pace, it just becomes a
Mhm.
bit middling to the top decks. And like
Yeah,
you mentioned,
I,
green steel.
I assume playing middling efficient threats and drawing cards will probably be very good against Ruby Amethyst, but I think it can still struggle against both Sapphire decks, but also Emerald Steel.
Yeah, for sure. All right, on to the next deck. Let's talk about Amethyst Steel. This is a deck that Kawa played at Lille. We did this deck always kind of gets talked about in conjunction with Ruby Amethyst because the deck lists are so similar. And I remember going into set 4, we were looking at Ruby Amethyst. We're like, okay, maybe Ruby Amethyst is not powerful enough. But we added a few additions in the form of the Flynn Riders and the Sisus, and it's like, okay, maybe it's there. How do you feel about Amethyst Steel, a deck that didn't really get access to the super powerful Ruby upgrades that Ruby Amethyst did?
Um, yeah, I think the deck's still fine, but it didn't really gain too many new things. Like the biggest upgrade to it is that Baboom is a great card in the meta now, and it gets to run Baboom while playing the normal low to the ground Amethyst Steel that we know from set 3. But I don't think that's really enough to compete with the 4 pillars.
Yeah, for sure. I think this for me kind of it actually lands in the same ranking it landed in set 3 for us, which is C tier. I know Kyle would definitely disagree, but it is what it is. All right. We're going to start heading to these top 4 meta decks soon, but before we get there, let's talk about blue, purple, or amethyst, sapphire, blurple. This deck, um, maybe it's underexplored. Maybe it's underexplored. Haven't heard a single thing about Blurple. I played against it a few times on ladder. Been very unimpressed because I was playing powerful decks like Ruby Sapphire. I feel like this deck might have actually fallen in power level in set 4, but at the same time, I'm not sure how much attention is being given to it. How many people are really trying to break this color combination right now?
Yeah, but I think just the Sapphire deck's getting so much more, like Sapphire Steel and Ruby Sapphire getting quite a bit better will spell bad things for Blurple's matchups into these decks. So I think it might have fallen off as well.
Yeah, do you think it goes into that C tier? You think it's down to unplayable now? I think it might be down to like high unplayable.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Yeah, I think Blurple has fallen into the unplayable tier.
Only problem is Blurple has some truthers behind it.
Yeah. All right. Next up, we have Ruby Amethyst, a deck that I brought to Atlanta in set 3, and a deck that I faded at the beginning of set 4. I was like, simply cannot compete with the power jump that some of these top decks in the metagame are getting. Um, Nevertheless, Ruby Amethyst did get some upgrades as well in terms of the Flynn package, as well as Sisu. It has access to inefficient, in my opinion, inefficient removal to deal with Diablo, but it does have access to that removal to deal with Diablo. So it can deal with Diablo, and then it just does the Ruby Amethyst thing. Queen's Castle as a location has just gotten more powerful. Pretty much every single deck has gotten worse at dealing with Queen's Castle due to deck building restrictions and due to metagame conditions changing and different decks being represented in the metagame. I think Queen's Castle is kind of an all-star right now. And Ruby Amethyst, as we look into week 2 and look towards Chicago, for me, I'm saying it feels like an S tier deck. If you want to put it in high A tier, I won't fault you. I'll let you do it, but I would say I feel like it's an S tier deck. I feel like it's creeping up. You know, it got King Undisputed, the Edict removal. It has brawls. I don't like brawls or removal, but it has brawls to deal with those pesky threats. And then Flynn Sisu. So Flynn Sisu drastically increased Ruby Amethyst's sort of efficacy in the Ruby Sapphire matchup. You drop Flynn Sisu Castle against Blue Red on the play, they're in a tough spot.
Yeah, and that was enough to single-handedly make a bad matchup against Ruby Sapphire to a pretty good one.
Yeah. What are you thinking in terms of tier? You think this is do we still have to temper our feelings about Ruby Amethyst, or can we put it in S tier? I think if we put it in S tier, it's a bit of a gamble. I would take that gamble.
I will allow you to put it in S.
Okay.
So I personally think the Emerald Steel matchup is a bit rough, but in your experiences has been pretty good. So it's still like a little bit up in the air.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's only been on ladder. We haven't had a chance to internally test it yet. But what I found, so the flip in the Emerald Steer matchup and why it has maybe gotten better in set 3 is because with the lack of inclusion of Prince John, it feels like you can actually reliably draw cards and sort of play to that as an out, right? Like where beforehand you would maybe opt to not draw the card off Rabbit or opt to, not sing the friends or something. Like it was just hard to draw cards because your opponent was constantly threatening getting so much value out of you by making you discard those cards later and then drawing a ton of cards themselves. So it just feels like it does feel like the matchup was better with, in my opinion, it feels like the matchup was better without Prince John. And that is really the crux of it. That being said, I think it can still be a tough matchup for sure. My experience on ladder has been very good, but we can never take that as the truth. So we'll throw it up in S tier, and I think that's like probably going to be our spiciest pick for like a top deck is Ruby Amethyst, because it's very much an emerging deck right now, and I think a lot of people are fading it looking at Chicago. All right, next up we have the winner of the Atlanta Lorcana Challenge in set 3, the rogue deck that took the whole thing down. We have Amber Amethyst. Where does it land in set 4? You know, a key card to that deck was Perdita. Perdita now gets hit by removal that is in everybody's deck that's there to deal with Diablo. You think this deck is going to hold out in set 4?
I think the deck is not playable.
Not playable, all the way down to unplayable. It's not even a C tier for you. All the way down to unplayable. Talk to me a little bit about that. Because I actually think this deck has a decent matchup in Ruby Amethyst. I think it can be okay into Ruby Amethyst. You know, if it takes the more aggressive line, you know, it gets out the Chernobogs. Like, it can create an engine that Ruby Amethyst has a really hard time dealing with. It's not a matchup I particularly like as Ruby Amethyst. That being said, I do think that the other top decks, the other pillar decks we have for the top 4 decks, do pretty well into it. Is that your experience?
I mean, I don't face the deck. No one plays the deck. But if it has 3 bad matchups against the best 4 decks, that's not very playable.
Okay, I'm putting in the highest tier of unplayable. The highest tier. All right. We're about to get out of sort of rogue decks, but you know, one we do have to talk about, and one that I guess has been getting a little bit of buzz. I don't know. Savige was streaming today, basically. We have Emerald Amber. So I mean, I don't even know how they build this. I think it's like the Big Songs deck. It was a deck that was popularized like day 1 of the metagame. It was on everybody's sort of early brews as things to do. Where do you find its landing as we lead up to Chicago?
I think the deck's actually quite powerful. The Under the Sea, the Muses, Painting the Roses Red, it can do some really fun and powerful stuff, but my problem with the deck has usually been that once you do get board wiped once, it doesn't come back from that whatsoever. And it will get board wiped by the Ruby decks at some point. And for that reason, I think it is I would be fine with either B or C tier.
I think I'm throwing in high C tier right now. I don't have a ton of experience with it. I've only faced it a few times, but I'd have a hard time putting it in the power level of Ruby Amber. You know, Ruby Amber does have that bad matchup in a green steel, which really hurts it in terms of the metagame, but I feel like Ruby Amber is still like a way more powerful deck. I am genuinely, I'm kind of like, I'm just side-eyeing Ruby Amber constantly, because despite the deck not really performing, like the few experiences I have playing against it, I'm like, wow, this deck is so much more powerful than it used to be. Like, it is doing some really powerful stuff. That could be me as a Ruby Amethyst pilot, where I'm like, wow, this deck is drawing more cards than me, quests for more than me, removes more stuff than me. So it could just be a bad matchup. But anyway, all right, winner of the set 3 Lorcana Challenge in Lille, we have Amber Steel, a deck that's been around since set 1. Where do you think it lands in set 4?
Maybe it's so this is another deck that hasn't gotten a crazy amount of support, but the deck is so well functioning just off the first 3 sets that it doesn't need that much support. I think it will still be able to do the unfair things it was already doing in the last sets, and I think it can keep up with a few of the top decks as well. Um, One cost Cinderella into Storm Rage on is like incredible against all these Flynn Rider Diablo type decks,
Yeah,
and I still think it can be beat here.
I'm assuming that does this no longer have a good matchup into Green Steel? Because I would think it does. Like even despite Green Steel not running a lot of the ward and stuff, I would assume this still has a good matchup into Green Steel. I think its matchup into Blue Steel and Sapphire Ruby is probably bad, but it kind of always has been. So I mean, this is one of these decks that I feel like you're right. It's not getting a lot of attention. I'm not hearing about it, but I don't know. I still feel like it has to be powerful. Like I can't imagine that it really fell off that hard. Where do you think it
Yeah, I agree.
lands? Where
I
what
think
tier
I
is
think
it?
it's B tier,
B tier? You think it's a
like right behind Bufasa.
yeah. This is one of those decks where I'm this by far is the one I'm the least sure on, where it could show up and it could do really well at these at Chicago, and I would just say yeah, that was the one I took the risk on. Is that would definitely be this deck. All right, we have 2 decks left, and they happen to both be very, very good decks. All right, let's start off with Sapphire Steel or Blue Steel, a deck that has gotten a lot of attention recently. I know Savige was running it up. I don't know if he ran it up to rank 1 or not, but there's tons of different lists. Like there's so many different ways to build it. Previously in set three, one of the things that was really holding it back was like, oh, the Ruby Sapphire matchup is really bad. Well, you added a few tech cards in there, it can actually get a lot better. And it seems like that matchup has gotten, on the aggregate, a lot better in set 4. That being said, surprisingly, some of us playing Blue Steel have run into Green Steel feeling like a bad matchup now in set 4. A matchup you would have thought was really, really good. Obviously, a lot of it comes down to build, and there's varying builds for Blue Steel, but it is, in my opinion, one of the most powerful decks in the metagame. It's also I think it's the most fun deck in the metagame. You can basically draw your entire deck. You can, quickly quest with dimes and Tamatoas for like, I don't know, 15 to 27. It's just crazy. What do you think about Blue Steel?
I think Blue Steel's incredible, and it's a very tough deck to build, and there's lots of ways to build it. The Ruby Sapphire matchup, I think the biggest reason it has become a lot better is okay, Tamatora can quest for more with 8 items, it's more consistent with 8 items, but also I think it's the new aerial is the main reason, but now Savage, for example, has cut the 6 cost aerial completely and still thinks the matchup's good. I don't agree with that. I think without it, Ruby Sapphire is still favored if they know what they are doing. The Emerald Steel matchup was at first, I think, a big reason why people wanted to play Sapphire
Yeah.
Steel. I think it's a lot closer, at least, to what people thought in the beginning. Um, but yeah, I think the deck is incredible and definitely deserves a spot in S tier as well.
Yep. I think it is an S tier deck for sure. All right. On to our last deck, Ruby Sapphire. This deck got a lot better in set 4. And actually, kind of it just changed a lot as well. So it has access to so much removal now. So it has the ice blocks, sort of taking down the attack power of your opposing character. So your Medusa can hit tons of things. Your Sisus are hitting a lot of things. Often we favor running the 3-cost Inkable Sisu, but of course you can shift that in the top end 8-cost uninkable Sisu and have these one-sided Be Prepareds. There's varying ways to build a deck. Some people are playing 0 Be Prepared, some people are playing 2 or more. You can have an amount of Tremaines or not to deal with said Ariel. When it comes to the ultimate build of, I mean, honestly, any Lorcana deck, but we're talking Ruby Sapphire right now. Meta conditions do matter, and that is going to tailor your build a bit. But ultimately, for me, I think I wouldn't be surprised. It could go for any of the decks in the top 4. Probably not Ruby Amethyst. So if we look at Green Steel, Blue Steel, and Blue Red, at the end of set 4, I expect us to look back at set 4 and say one of those was the best deck. I
Yeah,
100% expect, over the course of 2+ months, I expect one of those 3 decks to be sort of heralded as the best deck of set 4. What are your thoughts on this Blue Red?
Ruby Sapphire is the deck I played the most so far in set 4. On hardcore ladder, I've had 71% so far over like 70 games, and those are numbers I barely reached with any deck in set 3. Um, for whatever reason that might be, but I think the deck is extremely powerful. One thing I want to say is in set 3 it used to be this like somewhat more polarizing deck where it's very risky to bring, but it has these few very good matchups. I think right now a lot of its matchups are actually very close against Emerald Steel, Sapphire Steel, Ruby Amethyst. All of these matchups are really close matchups.
Yeah, it is funny. It was a very polarizing deck back in set 3. It was seen as a deck that beat up on these whole new world decks, but then was sort of very weak against the aggro decks. But the addition of all these different pieces of removal that have been teched in anyway to deal with Diablo, it just makes you a lot stronger against those aggro decks. It doesn't really have the weaknesses that it used to have in set 3, but I would say its matchup polarity on the positive end has also smoothed out a bit. So it's not just kind of like auto winning in a blue steel, and it's not nearly as favored as it was in the Ruby Amethyst in set 3. I think both you and I have a bias towards this type of deck and this type of gameplay, but I would even be happy enough to throw that above Green Steel. So I think Green Steel is a great deck. I think it's going to be the most popular deck, and I think it's for a reason. But the sheer power level of Ruby Sapphire just impresses me in set 4.
I think it's also the deck. I might be wrong on this, but that got the most wins on average in like TIERLIST event.
Yeah.
So I personally don't have like very strong opinions on which of these decks is like slightly better than the others from the top 4 decks, but it definitely deserves a spot in these top 4 decks.
Yep. And, looking at our tier list now, I think this encapsulates my thoughts on the metagame. Maybe Emerald Amethyst is a little bit high, because really when we talk about the gap between the top 4 decks and the decks below, it is palpable. You can feel it. Like the top decks are more powerful, in my opinion, than they ever have been. The gaps are bigger. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but these top 4 decks are just doing things that other decks, it feels like they can't even come close to at points. And their matchup spreads into the metagame are better than other decks as well. They don't have nearly as polarizing matchups. So in my opinion, right now, looking to Chicago, I believe that the metagame will be determined and dictated by Ruby Sapphire, Emerald Steel, Sapphire Steel, and Ruby Amethyst. Ruby Amethyst kind of being that last one to sneak up in there. So Moyen, I'm gonna put you on the spot. You don't have to be right. You got to pick one deck that's gonna win Chicago. Where you placing your bet?
I have to pick Ruby Sapphire then. It's just my baby.
Yeah, I think that's a good pick. I'm honestly, I might say Green Steel, because I feel like so many people are gonna bring it. It's just gonna be a numbers game at this point. Shout. I do think that will be the most played deck. It could be like there could be this crazy card availability thing that goes on where people actually bring Ruby Amethyst as the most played deck because it did just surge in popularity. But I still think like Green Steel is just, that's on the tip of everybody's tongue right now. Anyway, that concludes our set 4 Lorcana Challenge Chicago tier list. Let us know what we got right. Let us know what we got wrong. If you're interested in this type of content, be sure to subscribe. We have a weekly podcast every single week. Guests on all the time. People like Savige, Alpha, Speci, all Lorcana creators that hop on the podcast, and that releases on Friday every single week. So be sure to subscribe and check us out. Thank you all so much for listening. Enjoy the coverage this weekend, and good luck to everybody competing in Chicago.